Hi guys, so hopefully this will be the last recording. I'm starting to feel a little bit better, so I'm hoping that I will be back on Thursday. But we're going to start talking about aerobic respiration. And respiration's the main topic of this unit. And basically respiration is kind of the opposite of photosynthesis. So we'll refer back to a lot of the photosynthesis equations. Now aerobic is meaning with oxygen. So keep that in mind. Later we will talk about a process that doesn't use oxygen, but for today the main topic is going to be aerobic respiration. Okay, so aerobic respiration is the process of breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen to release energy that is transferred into ATP. So notice we're breaking down glucose. So the whole point of photosynthesis was for plants to make their own glucose. That was the end product. Here it's kind of the opposite. We start with glucose. Now we get our energy. That'd be pretty awesome if we could make our own glucose, but obviously we don't go through photosynthesis, so we get our energy from eating other plants or other animals. And what we do, so our food is mostly broken down into sugars, and then with the presence of oxygen, it allows us to make energy, and that energy is transferred into ATP. And yesterday we learned a lot about ATP and kind of what it's used for in our bodies. And we talked about active transport and any type of energy or chemical reaction that our body may need to start. ATP is going to be the main source of energy. So photosynthesis' main purpose was to convert light energy into chemical energy. As far as respiration, the main purpose is going to make energy in a usable form of ATP. So for every one glucose molecule, we're going to want to try to make as many ATP as possible. Okay, so step one is glycolysis. Let's break this word down. Glyco is talking about glucose. Lysis is talking about to break down. So every living thing uses glycolysis. If we look at this up in a definition, it's talking about the splitting of glucose. So think back to the equation for photosynthesis. The cool thing is, I think most people got this one right on the test. There's only a few people that missed it. If you take the equation for photosynthesis and flip it, then you have the equation for respiration. So we'll see that towards the end. One glucose molecule, so remember glucose is C6H12O6. We have 6 carbon, is going to be split into 2 pyruvic acids, and each pyruvic acid has 3 carbon. So the first stage, we're going to be splitting the glucose molecule. And again, we have glyco, which we're talking about sugars here, glucose, and lysis is to split or break down. Here you can see the molecular formula. We're taking one glucose molecule and splitting it into 2 pyruvic acids. Okay, here it says 2 ATP are gained, but in parentheses it says net. Now since this is honors, we do go into a little bit more detail here. So basically how this works is kind of a give and a take scenario. So in order to get to ATP, we actually, in order for glycolysis to occur, we have to put in 2 ATP to get it started. So in order to break down one molecule of glucose into 2 pyruvic acids, we have to use 2 ATP. So we have to use some energy first in order to allow it to happen. So we use 2 ATP, and then what happens is we're able to get 4 ATP at the end. Now since we get 4 ATP, but we had to use 2 to start, that's where this net comes from. So our total after that equation gives us 2 ATP. And this is going to be happening in the cytoplasm of the cells. Here's a picture to kind of demonstrate that. So we start with glucose, and remember this comes from our food, sugars, everything that we eat gets broken down to glucose. In order to break it down, we need 2 ATP. Remember from yesterday's notes, in order to use ATP energy, remember that last bond between the phosphates gets broken between the last 2, and that releases the energy, and it goes into ADP. Goes back into its kind of partially charged battery form. Okay? Then once we're able to convert it to 2 pyruvic acids, this process makes 4 ATP, and it makes 2 NADH. Okay, so if we have 4, but we needed 2, that's where the 2 net comes from. So overall, we get a total of 2, and we get our 2 pyruvic acids. So the outcome of glycolysis are our products. We still use reactants and products here. So reactant would be glucose here and 2 ATP. Our products would be 2 pyruvic acids, 4 ATP, and 2 NADPH. Or sometimes we'll just put the product as 2 ATP because we're subtracting these. Now this says to the electron transport chain, which we'll talk a little bit later on in the notes. But for this process, remember this is like an electron carrier. It's carrying those high energy hydrogens and electrons, and we're going to use that as later for a later energy source. Okay, so recap with glycolysis. Glucose is split into 2 pyruvic acids, 2 ATP are gained, and it occurs in the cytoplasm. So that's kind of a little bit of an idea of what's going on. Now, hopefully everyone knows the answer to this, but when we think of respiration, we talked about this in cells. This is the powerhouse of the cell where we get all of our energy. So hopefully everyone has an organelle in mind, but most of this is going to be taking place in the mitochondria, and that's where we're going to head to next. So this first step occurs in the cytoplasm, and then we head to the mitochondria for step 2, the Krebs cycle. It is sometimes called citric acid cycle, but for this class we'll call it the Krebs cycle. It happens in the mitochondria. Now, once we're in the mitochondria, those 2 pyruvic acids that we just made are going to be broken down even further into carbon dioxide. Now remember, in photosynthesis, plants take CO2 in. That's one of the reactants. But for respiration, what do we do with CO2? We exhale. Every time we exhale, we're exhaling CO2. So it's actually a product for us. And then during this process, 2 ATP are also gained. So let's think overall how much ATP we've made so far from one glucose molecule. We had 2 from glycolysis and now 2 from the Krebs cycle. So right now we're sitting at 4 total ATP. Okay, another step that actually happens, there's lots of hydrogens. So we made our CO2, the hydrogens from glucose and the electrons. These hydrogens are going to be picked up by NAD and FAD. Again, those are like electron carriers, like in photosynthesis, NADPH. Kind of similar. These guys are going to carry these high energy electrons and hydrogens to later be used for more energy to make ATP. So from the Krebs cycle, we get a lot of hydrogens that are picked up by NAD and FAD to make NADH and FADH2. So other energy sources, these are going to be carried to the next step, and these carry the energy source to make ATP. So again, the whole point of respiration is to make energy in a usable form. So we want to try to make as much ATP. And so far, we only have 4, which for one glucose molecule doesn't really seem like a lot. So we're wanting to make a lot more, and these energy sources are going to help us get that. Which brings us to our last step, still in the mitochondria. For short, we call it ETC. The electron transport chain is its official name. So the hydrogen electrons that were carried by NAD and FAD are used to supply the energy for 32 ATP. So that's where we're getting the bulk of our ATP. Now if we add the 2 from glycolysis and the 2 from Krebs, we now have a total of 36 ATP. So that's kind of a lot for one glucose molecule, and that's how many we want to get. Now, in your book, a really good picture of this in the book, but kind of what it's going to look like with the electrons. There's little chains, and they carry the electrons down. They start with a lot of high energy, and by the time they get down to the end of the transport chain, that's where they're making the ATP, and they kind of lose their energy by the end. So the big things that are happening in here is that we're making a lot of ATP. Once this is completed, oxygen, because obviously we need oxygen for this process, and that's what we breathe in, and the leftover hydrogen atoms bond to make water. And that's pretty important because if it doesn't form that water base there, it can be kind of toxic. which is leaving the open oxygen there, so it's good that it bonds with the hydrogen to make a water form. Okay, here's a very important note. If we don't have any oxygen, without the oxygen, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain do not occur. So we can still do glycolysis because that's in the cytoplasm, and you don't need oxygen for that. But however, remember, we only get 2 ATP. So compared to 36, obviously we're going to want to do the full aerobic respiration. And later in the week, possibly even next week, we'll talk about what happens when we don't have oxygen and what are some other options. But as far as aerobic respiration and having oxygen, we obviously want to do the one that's going to give us more ATP because we're getting more energy. Okay, and that leaves us with our equation. Glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen to produce CO2, H2O, and 36 ATP. So you can see the equation, which everyone in here should know this already, because it's the exact opposite of photosynthesis. So remember, for photosynthesis, we needed 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and they were on this side, and we also needed sunlight. Luckily, we don't need sunlight to do respiration, so we don't have sunlight in the equation anymore. So everything's reversed. This time we need 1 molecule of glucose, 6 oxygen, and that's going to allow us to exhale carbon dioxide. We have 6. We make water, we talked about at the end, and then our final outcome is 36 ATP. So overall, this is our final equation for respiration, aerobic respiration. Okay. Now we do have this funny little saying to help us remember these, because there's a lot of steps that are going on. And let's see if I can write it on here. Oh, I don't think it's going to let me. Try one thing. Okay, so basically it's like a little rap, and again, it's kind of a little silly, but it does help you remember what steps go where they're at, and how many ATP you get. So the first is the process. Man, let me just pull up one thing and then... Okay. There we go. Almost there. Okay, you can write this down if you want to. Again, it is very helpful. But it goes G to the K to the ETC, cytomito 2232, which the last part doesn't really rhyme, which is kind of silly, but the first part does. So basically, it helps us with the steps. Glycolysis is in the cytoplasm with 2 ATP. Then you have Krebs in the mitochondria with 2, ETC in the mitochondria with 32. So again, it goes G to the K to the ETC, cytomito 2232.